Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tech Breakdown. My name is Manasa, and I'm a journalist covering tech, politics, and the intersection between the two. I'm here with another episode diving into conversations surrounding technology and social media. In the last episode in this series, we looked at the business of big data and how people like you and me are becoming products in an increasingly digital world. Today, we'll be looking at what's being done to tackle the issues arising from the digital space and the way it is structured. We are going to look at regulation. We'll be asking questions like, is regulation the fix to our problems? Digital monopolies, privacy issues, opaque and biased algorithms, commercial and political ad targeting, misinformation, disinformation, distrust in media and experts. I can go on listing, but can regulation lead the way to a better online and offline world that reins in on these issues? What about regulations already in place, especially in Europe, which has some of the strictest rules for tech companies? Is it really working? And what about the rest of the world, which is like more than 90% of the world's population? Also, what seems to be the hottest topic of our times, artificial intelligence. Can we regulate our way through the rise and spread of AI? To take a dive into this world of tech regulation, I have with me Marietje Schaake. She is the International Policy Director at the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford University. Before that, for a decade, she was a member of the European Parliament. And currently, she's also a board member with several nonprofits, including the Real Facebook Oversight Board, for which this interview is being filmed. Marietje has a lot of expertise with implementing tech policy, and she'll also run us through some of the new big tech bills like the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. But we'll come to these heavy sounding laws later on, but let's first catch up on the basics. You were active in policy making for a decade, working as a member of the European Parliament, and you continue to sort of advise on some matters. And you were there when the General Data Protection Regulation, what's commonly called GDPR, was introduced in the European Union in 2016. Is that right? And so for anyone who has no clue about what GDPR is, it is basically a law in Europe for data protection and privacy. It is considered one of the most sort of serious and strictest regulations in the world. Would you say that is true? And in simple words, could you also tell us what GDPR does?
So the General Data Protection Regulation deals with the obligations on the part of anyone, governments, public organizations, but also private companies, including tech companies, in how they handle personal data. And so many people look to GDPR because it was one of the first landmark regulations that really spelled out these kinds of obligations in the modern era, because many countries have some sort of data protection law, but not specifically catered to electronic or digital data. And it's a good question to ask whether it's the strictest in the world, because it does put serious requirements on, for example, tech companies, but it tends to be very weak when it comes to enforcement. And that is a serious problem. And I think it is a general point that often gets overlooked, which is there are press releases and anticipations around a new law. Look at the discussion that's very vivid right now around the EU AI Act that is about to be concluded. People really look to the law when it's presented, when it's voted on, when it enters into force, and then they tend to lose interest when it comes to the enforcement. Well, that's actually where the rubber hits the road. And so I think in spirit, the GDPR could be very strict, but the enforcement needs to be done better. And in fact, you can see that the AI Act learns from the not perfect enforcement of the General Data Protection Regulation. So hopefully we'll do better.
Mm-hmm. You do highlight the enforcement aspect, which comes after obviously the legislation has been put in place, but also it's also largely been the case that academics, researchers, journalists are usually playing catch up with the so-called latest breakthroughs in tech. Something sort of becomes the latest cool thing, and then people working on policy sort of scramble around to put some mechanisms in place. Do you also get that sense, because you actually have worked in policy? And in that context, do you think regulation then has worked, and how does one assess success going on?
So I think it's a mixed picture, really. There are definitely flavor of the day kind of discussions, the way we think about generative AI now, whereas a year from now, I think few people would have heard about large language models and how they might break through one day. What I've seen during my 10 years as a member of European Parliament was both very sort of niche discussions. Take, for example, the subject of net neutrality, which a lot of people are working on. It sort of deals with how internet traffic should be equally treated and not prioritized. So it's very closely related to fair competition, which was an enormously impactful law, but one that didn't really catch a lot of attention. Now, there have been other laws, like, for example, those dealing with copyright protections online that were very hotly debated, and the GDPR that you just mentioned was as well. And lawmakers always have to be mindful not to legislate for the headlines in the news, that they do their own research, that they listen to experts, and that they try to get a comprehensive picture of what is at stake. Ideally, because they have identified a challenge, because it's also good to keep in mind that policy is often adjusted or made in reaction to a problem, the violation of rights, an unfair treatment, new developments like clarity on how damaging certain new innovations are for the environment, or new health risks that have surfaced. So it is actually normal and I think unchangeable in many ways that policies will often come after a new situation has emerged. But of course, ideally, one would anticipate what comes next. So, for example, when it comes to emerging technologies specifically, what I hope will happen is that instead of really trying to spell out the very details of the very latest new technology in every law, that it would be much more about which principles do we need to preserve no matter what emerging technology breaks through, and double down on the enforcement. So it's almost like turning the whole legislative model upside down. Instead of having very detailed laws and very weak enforcement, you want to go to very widely applicable principles that will then be worked out in detail by the enforcement agency. Because today we're talking about generative AI. In 1 or 2 or 3 years, no doubt there will be more breakthroughs. We don't know exactly what they will be and what the new challenges will be. We can anticipate, but we also have to make sure that the laws are flexible enough to sort of embrace the ever-changing breakthroughs of new technologies.
Recently, Meta, Facebook, was fined $1.2 billion for mishandling user information, basically transferring data from the European Union to the United States, so unlawfully processing this data. And they can't anymore transfer data in this manner. And as I understand, they've also been asked to get rid of this data within a certain period of time. Is that right? And do you also see that as a win for GDPR and regulation?
Well, it's definitely important that when there is a violation, especially of this scale, that there are consequences. You know, a law loses its legitimacy completely when there is no consequence to violation. You know, if no one ever gets a fine for crossing a red light, then surely nobody would stop anymore. So the same goes for tech companies. And I think the addition of requiring to remove data would go a long way to prevent illegitimately obtained data, which is a huge topic now in the context of large language models and internet data being scraped by big tech companies, not being illegitimately acquired and then sort of recycled for new purposes, if you know what I mean. So I think it could actually be a game changer if illegitimately obtained data can no longer be used, for example, in the context of large language models and artificial intelligence, because it would really change the whole business model of the big companies that have essentially tried to just assemble as much data as they possibly could. Now, GDPR deals mostly with private data. There's also non-private data that can be very valuable and that can be illegitimately obtained. So I think the whole question of data gathering, data selling, data retention, privacy is cast in a new light because of the developments in artificial intelligence. And I can only hope that not only in Europe, where this is already firmly on the political agenda, but also in the United States, there will be stronger protections for people against the outsized power and sort of unrestricted use of data by big tech companies like Facebook.
So you do think that punitive measures in this sense work? Because I guess Meta has been fined. I mean, at different stages, it has been fined for various breaches, and yet it does continue to act quite unethically and also unlawfully.
Right.
So do you think punitive measures do still have a promise?
So I think it depends on what the punitive measures might be. Financial sanctions, I think, are simply calculated as the cost of doing business, and they are absorbed in the billions of revenue and profit that these companies make. So in that sense, it's helpful to have them because you need to do something, but I'm in favor of the more progressive type of sanctions where a financial fine is a percentage of global annual turnover. And so that would really go a long way of saying, you know, there will be a significant part of the monetary gains of that year charged as a sanction, which is different from a sort of blanket amount or otherwise calculated amount. In this case, I think the requirement to delete data could actually be much more punishing for Facebook. It could actually be more complicated for them, and it could set a precedent for other companies, which will potentially change the game when it comes to the use of data for AI and other new purposes. So one of the challenges that we see with tech companies is that they ask consent for the use of data in one context. And then the context changes, but the consent is assumed to sort of continue. And that practice also shows that the whole consent-based model is flawed, because you have entire user design teams, lawyer teams, product teams at companies like Facebook, but also other big tech companies, doing everything they can to make sure that you click yes when your consent is asked. And when all your options, you know, this whole menu of options of all the kinds of tracking you can turn on and off, a lot of people simply don't take time to go through what is being tracked. They rather click the green button that is so prominently and easily accessible for them, instead of going through the whole selection of switching the levers and selecting which data can and cannot be collected. So the whole model that's based on consent is supposed to be informed consent, puts a lot of questions about how much information do consumers have, how meaningful is that consent really, and what does it mean when data about you is a part of a much more collective set of data points, instead of just your quote unquote search history online, your financial information, your emails, content, and so on. So when you are actually part of a much larger data set, and how that could be used in the context of training AI presents very different kinds of regulatory challenges than the ones that are attempted to be addressed by this notion of informed consent.
Right. So you, not just as an individual, as your private information, but you in a collective as well, and how that plays out. Right. And could you sort of we discussed a bit about GDPR, and could we move to more recent measures introduced in Europe, specifically the Digital Services and Digital Markets Act? And these are measures basically to introduce sort of improve competition and also promote digital safety, as I understand. Could you tell us a bit more about these, and if you think there are important lessons to learn from them while implementing similar regulations in other countries?
Right. So the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act are often talked about as twin regulations. So they were basically developed and adopted in a very similar time span. And they deal with related but different aspects of the business models of big tech companies. The Digital Services Act is much more explicit about the obligations of social media companies, but also search companies when it comes to content moderation. So, for example, when there's hateful content or discriminatory content or terrorist content or child sexual abuse content, all kinds of content that might go around online, disinformation as well, that ranges between what's already illegal and on the books to what could present a public health problem, a public safety problem. For example, if a lot of people are changing their behavior around public health, like around a pandemic, but it's based on falsehoods, then society has a problem. The same with, for example, the manipulation of social media platform business models for political gains during elections, like misleading people about when the election might take place or sending all kinds of other information. There's a whole spectrum of content online that could present societal problems, but that's not, strictly speaking, illegal in a number of jurisdictions. And what the Digital Services Act is trying to do is to spell out more about the obligations of tech companies in terms of how quickly they need to take down content when they're notified by the responsible authorities, and how they may use their algorithms, what kind of transparency is required when it comes to curating content, for example. So when you think Digital Services Act, think content moderation. When you think Digital Markets Act, think platforms. So the companies that are a platform, it could be retailers, it could be even companies like Booking, you know, where you book a hotel. Platforms, in other words, also Facebook, Twitter, that have a large amount of users. They are obliged to take on board certain measures like interoperability that increase competition and do not create some kind of drawbridges up strategy where the big companies only get bigger and the small companies cannot compete, in part because of the network effect, because people kind of get locked in to some of these commercial services where, for example, it's really hard when you're on a social media company like Facebook and you want to go somewhere else, but you cannot take your friends, then it really becomes less attractive to leave. So the notion of interoperability would also allow for more offerings on platforms like Facebook so that there's not this sort of total capture into a Facebook world that happens once you've signed up in the first place. And here the fines for violation are actually related to the revenues of the company. So the idea is that oftentimes antitrust rules and cases only kick in after damage has already been done. A case needs to be brought, it has to be proven, it can take years of proceedings. And in the case of the Digital Markets Act, the idea is that the obligations for all companies are spelled out much more clearly. And if they don't comply, there will be hefty financial fines.
I want to move from more a technical space to a more philosophical space, if you may, and ask if you've ever had the feeling that speaking about or concentrating on regulation as the fix prevents us from thinking about other aspects of the problem, as in an over-reliance on regulation and legislative frameworks could be dangerous, sort of putting us in a post-problem fix rather than developing sort of a thinking and ecosystem to prevent problems in the first place?
I'm not sure. I actually think that for a long time, regulation has not been taken seriously enough. And so I do think it's good that there's more attention for it. And hopefully that will also prove to be a valid sort of focus with the new results of a whole series of new regulations in Europe, which is where most of the action in the democratic world is actually happening. So, I mean, it's probably also my professional deformation and bias in the sense that I was a regulator. And so I think that it's important, or I was a lawmaker, maybe it should be framed differently for nuance there. But laws are incredibly important. And I think for people in civil society, they are trying to impact the way and influence the way laws work. Companies are spending millions on lobbying, and it's not without reason. So I think if we only were to follow the money and follow the energy that people devote to influencing regulations and laws, then you can definitely see that it is of influence. Otherwise, this would be a total waste. And I don't think that that's how companies like to play.
Mm-hmm. And you did mention that most of this regulation is based in Europe, and there is some, even though not enough in the US. But there are a whole list of other countries that suffer the consequences of technological inventions from Silicon Valley and elsewhere, but they do have no way of protecting themselves from harm. How do you see that playing in other countries?
Well, you're absolutely right. And I didn't mean to imply that the EU or the US are the most important in any way. In fact, I think that the global South or the majority world will actually be key in deciding the future of democracy, the future of tech regulation. And as we speak, I'm hoping to develop a program about that at Stanford University. And we've just brought out a edited volume. So our attention is very focused on the rest of the world outside of the West when it comes to tech regulation and tech policy. How do I think it will play out? Well, I think if there's not more deliberate action on the part of democratic governments, but also governments in global South countries, then companies are really going to make strong advances in these communities that may be less protected by, for example, data protection laws. A lot of people in the majority world are actually not protected by any law when it comes to the handling of their data. And meanwhile, there's more and more data collected, sometimes biometric data, for example, all introduced as an opportunity for economic development and for innovation in these communities that are often very deprived of such opportunities. So in other words, it sounds very nice, it sounds very attractive, but people may not always know what they're consenting to and will then find themselves at risk for violations of their privacy, or maybe even worse, right? State surveillance and so on and so forth. So I think it is key that we have a better understanding of the issues as they reach from Silicon Valley all the way to communities in Nigeria or Bangladesh or Kazakhstan, for that matter, to have a better sense of how technologies used in various contexts can actually harm people in very specific ways. I think Facebook has learned the hard way in Myanmar, where it had hardly any resources dedicated to content moderation and cultural context, and where hate speech ended up playing a huge role in the genocidal violence that happened there against the Rohingya, and online platforms like Facebook were key in distributing that hatred. So understanding how a platform that may be sold as a fun tool to keep in touch with friends and organize events can actually be a part of mass violence is an important lesson, and an important field to study much more, and hopefully then influence, first of all, the behavior of these companies, but also influence the behavior of the very powerful governments in the most advanced economies that are still spending development support, but often without preconditions at all for how technologies are used or what laws might be in place to protect people.
It's interesting because some of these countries also do not have cooperative governments, is what I sort of start thinking of, because even in Europe or in the US, there are lawmakers who want to put this legislation in place. But for instance, if I take India, it has an authoritarian government that is quite benefiting out of the chaos it's creating because of the way these social media platforms function, and have been found to be bullying tech companies as well to gain favors. In that case, how do you see regulation helping, and what does one do?
Well, this is not only about regulation, because of course regulation doesn't happen across borders. It's not possible for European lawmakers to decide what the law on the books would be in India, even though there's of course concern about the deep democratic backsliding that's happening in India, particularly as it happens to so many people. The country now almost the most populous in the world, if it hasn't already reached that. And so there's deep concern about the fact that India presents as a democracy, but actually ends up treating journalists, minorities, civil liberties, and all those very important ingredients of a rule of law and democracy-based society so badly. So here I think it is much more about making clear what is expected of companies, because tech companies tend to really try to play it both ways. On the one hand, there's a narrative that we often hear, which is, do not regulate us in, for example, the United States, because we are the best defense against authoritarianism. I don't know if you've ever heard this kind of argument, but it's actually quite powerful, particularly in the context of concern for the rise of China. At the same time, tech companies will not do much to withstand or stand up against authoritarian demands or uses of their platforms. And so they will have to make firmer choices where they stand. And I think this is where governments, for example, the US government, could make a big difference, because these companies are American, and there could be much more articulation of what is expected of them. There could be, for example, dialogues to better understand how to assess the democratic backsliding in countries like India, and then what the consequences are. So I see a lot of room for improvement there, pressure on the companies, which should also come from the bottom up and from civil society, but also actually more credible expectations from democratic governments that are, in their foreign policies and in their political statements saying that democracy is so important, and at the same time allowing home-based companies to be part of anti-democratic tendencies in other parts of the world.
Let me quickly move also to AI. You did bring AI while we were going through other topics and questions. In terms of the way you see AI now rising and spreading, do you think it's a worry in terms of it amplifying the risks already caused by Meta and other social media companies? And do you think we can meaningfully regulate AI? And how do you see that playing in the next few years?
Well, all of these are extremely challenging, because generative AI and new breakthroughs in AI are definitely exacerbating some of the worst harms that we've already seen. For example, there are deep concerns about the erosion of trust, including in democracy. There are known problems around bias and discrimination through algorithmic uses, and this will only be exacerbated when there are new use cases that do not address these harms and discriminations, and that basically leave them in place, and then spreading through different uses of the algorithmic settings and the AI systems that get deployed right now without too much research in an independent manner on how these harms could be exacerbated, new harms could emerge. And I think that sort of grand experiment on society in and of itself is a big risk. And then all of this has a lot to do with the power concentration, which is also exacerbated by generative AI breakthroughs, where we had an already very powerful set of big tech companies that are now only getting more powerful because they're the only ones who can use and process through their computing power and their scraping of internet data, and they're holding on to that. They have capacities that hardly anyone has. And I think that's a real challenge for society, that there's so much power concentration in the hands of a few companies, whereas it's hard for researchers to get a sense of what new harms might be, how exactly these programs work out. And I worry about that very much. And let me just add on a closing note that may be slightly more optimistic when you asked, do you think meaningful regulation of AI is possible? I think it must be done. So it's not just a question of can it be done. Everything has to be brought to bear to make sure that this new technology fits within democratic frameworks and does not definitively disrupt them. And so I hope everybody is very motivated to make it such, and does not get too distracted by the entertainment value of the ChatGPT types of functions that might be fun on the laptop, but that really kind of, take away attention from the much bigger societal risks that come from these products being rolled out in real time with so many unknown consequences and potentially devastating impacts.
I really hope that's the case. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks. Have a nice day.